The call came at 6:47 inches the morning. I know the exact time because I had been awake since 5, sitting at my kitchen table with a cold cup of coffee and a stack of bank statements that didn't add up the way they should. I had been doing that a lot lately, staying up, running numbers, telling myself the headache, curling behind my left eye, was just stress, and not something I should worry about. I didn't answer the phone. I let it ring, watched my mother's name light up the screen, and waited for the vibration to stop. She'd call back. She always called back, and when she did, it would be about money. It was always about money. I grew up in a small house in Columbus, Ohio, the oldest of 2 kids. My brother Tyler is 4 years younger than me, and from the time we were children, the dynamic was set in stone. I studied, Tyler played. I earned scholarships. Tyler got bailed out. I got a degree in accounting, moved to Chicago at 22, and started sending money home by 23 because my mother told me that was what good daughters did. That was 9 years ago. In 9 years, I had sent my parents over $180,000. I know that number because I am an accountant. I track things. I have spreadsheets going back to my very first wire transfer, $600 the month after I got my first real paycheck, because my mother said the water heater had broken and they couldn't afford to fix it. I sent the money. The water heater, I later found out, had been broken for 6 months before she ever mentioned it to me. She had simply been waiting for me to start earning. That was the year I understood what I was. I was not the daughter. I was the investment. By 32, I was a senior analyst at a mid-size firm in the Loop. I had a small apartment in Wicker Park that I could barely afford because every raise I got, my mother somehow found out about within weeks, and the requests would scale up accordingly. Tyler needed $8,000 to start a food truck business. The food truck lasted 4 months. My father needed dental work, $3,400. Not covered by insurance. Please don't let him suffer. My mother wanted to remodel the kitchen because the neighbors had just renovated theirs and she couldn't stand to look at her old cabinets anymore. That one was $11,000. I said no 3 times before she stopped speaking to me for 2 weeks, and then I sent the money because the silence was somehow worse than the asking. I had $4,200 in savings. I was 32 years old, a senior analyst, and I had $4,000 to my name because everything else had gone south to Columbus. The phone rang again. I picked it up. "Your grandmother's ring is missing," my mother said, without hello. "I think it's in the storage unit, but I need you to cover this month's fee because we used that money for Tyler's rent." "Mom," I said, "I'm going to be late for work. It's not even 7. I have an early call." There was a pause, the kind she used when she was deciding whether to guilt me immediately or let it build. "Fine," she said, "but I need to know by Friday. The unit gets locked out Friday." I said I'd figure it out. I hung up. I sat with the headache for another 10 minutes, then got dressed, drank the cold coffee, and took the train downtown. I made it through 3 hours of work before the left side of my vision went strange. Not dark, exactly. More like static, like a television losing signal. I blinked. It didn't clear. I stood up from my desk to get water and the floor came up to meet me a lot faster than I expected. I woke up in an ambulance. The paramedic had kind eyes and asked me my name and whether I knew where I was. I told him both things. He told me my blood pressure was critically high and that someone at my office had called 911 when I didn't respond after hitting the floor. I asked him if I was going to be okay, and he said he needed me to stay calm and that the doctors would tell me more. At the hospital, they used words like hypertensive crisis and neurological monitoring, and we'd like to keep you for observation. A doctor who looked younger than me explained that the kind of blood pressure I'd been running could cause a stroke, and that if I had been alone when I collapsed, it might have gone very differently. She asked me about my stress levels, my sleep, my diet. I thought about the cold coffee and the bank statements, and Tyler's rent money. "Hi," I said. "All of it." They admitted me. My coworker, Renata, who had called the ambulance and ridden with me to the ER, sat with me until they moved me to a room. She was 47 and had the energy of someone who had survived enough to stop being impressed by crisis. She held my hand in the elevator and told me I was going to be fine and that she would call whoever I needed her to call. I gave her my mother's number. My mother called me 40 minutes later. They said it's your blood pressure, she said. Not are you okay, not I'm so scared, not I'm coming. She said it like a diagnosis was a character flaw. I told you that you work too hard. You never listen. Mom, they're saying it's serious. Well, you're stable, right? You're in the hospital. They'll take care of it. I heard something in the background, Tyler's voice, and then a woman laughing, and then what sounded like a crowd. Where are you? I asked. A pause. We're at Tyler's thing. Tyler's thing. Tyler had been planning a long weekend trip to Nashville with 6 of his friends to celebrate his upcoming engagement, a celebration that, I was fairly certain, I had partially funded by covering 2 months of his rent so he could save up for the trip. The engagement itself was to a woman named Kayla, who I had met exactly twice, and who referred to me as the sister with the money. The Nashville trip, I said. We just got here, my mother said. The hotel is lovely, Diana. You should see it, the pool is. Mom, I'm in the hospital. My blood pressure nearly gave me a stroke this morning. Another pause. Longer this time. The doctor said you're stable. Stable doesn't mean fine. Well, what do you want me to do? The flights were non-refundable. Your father already took the days off work. Tyler really needed us there. He's been so stressed about the proposal. I stopped listening after that. I heard her voice continuing. Something about how I had always been the strong one and how she knew I'd be okay, and I held the phone 6 inches from my face and stared at the fluorescent light on the ceiling and felt something in my chest go very, very quiet. They kept me for 4 days. In 4 days, my parents called me 6 times. All 6 calls were under 3 minutes. Tyler texted me once a string of emojis that I think were supposed to mean, get well soon, but the selection included a party hat and a champagne glass, so I wasn't entirely sure. Renata came every day. She brought me a book the 2nd day, and actual food the 3rd day, because she had asked what the hospital was feeding me and decided it was not acceptable. She sat with me for 2 hours on the 3rd evening, and we talked about things we had never talked about in 2 years, of working together, her divorce, my family, the particular exhaustion of being the person everyone assumes is handling everything. You don't have to keep doing this, she said. I know, I said. And I did know. I had known for years. Knowing and stopping are not the same thing. On the 4th day, a financial advisor named Marcus from the hospital's patient services office came to talk to me about the billing. My insurance would cover most of it, but there was a gap, and he wanted to go over my options. We sat together for an hour going through paperwork, and somewhere in the middle of that hour, he mentioned that the hospital had a program for patients dealing with financial stress, not charity. He clarified. Just resources. A non-profit that helped with financial counseling. He slid a pamphlet across the table. I didn't think much of it then. I went home on a Thursday. My apartment felt very small and very quiet. I had a list of follow-up appointments and a prescription and instructions to reduce stress, which struck me as the most optimistic medical advice I had ever received. My mother called that evening to tell me that the Nashville trip had been wonderful, and that Tyler's proposal had gone perfectly, and that Kayla had cried and it was all very beautiful, and she wished I could have been there. I said, I'm glad it went well. She said, oh, and I meant to ask, can you cover the storage unit by Friday? I know you've been dealing with a lot, but it's really just a small thing. I said, I'll let you know. I hung up and sat on my couch for a long time. Here is something about nearly having a stroke at 32. It changes your relationship with the word later. I had been living in later for 9 years. Later, I'll set limits. Later, I'll say no and mean it. Later, when things are more stable, when Tyler grows up, when my parents understand. The hospital had taken later off the table in a way that no amount of self-help podcasts ever had. My body had made the argument my brain kept losing. I opened my laptop. I went to my bank's website. I pulled up 9 years of transaction history, and I started going through it the way I went through everything at work methodically, without feeling, just looking for what was there. What I found was what I already knew. The transfers, the dates, the amounts. My family's needs rendered as a ledger. It should have made me angry. Instead, it just made me tired. I almost closed the laptop. I almost made tea and went to bed. But there was one entry I kept coming back to. A transfer from 8 years ago, 2 months after my grandfather, my mother's father, had died. It was a transfer into my account, not out of it. $500. From an attorney's office I didn't recognize. I had been 24, newly employed, and I had assumed at the time that it was some small distribution from his estate. I remembered thinking it was a nice gesture, and then forgetting about it almost immediately, because my mother had called that same week asking me to help with funeral expenses. I stared at that $500 for a long time. I pulled up the attorney's name. The firm was still operating a small estate law practice in Columbus. I wrote down the name. I told myself I was probably making something out of nothing. I called them the next morning. The woman who answered was efficient and polite, and asked me to hold while she pulled up the file. I sat on hold for 4 minutes with my coffee going cold beside me, which seemed to be a theme in my life. When she came back, her voice had shifted slightly. More careful. "Miss Patterson," she said, "are you the Diana Patterson listed as the primary beneficiary of the Harold Greer estate?" My grandfather's name was Harold Greer. "Yes," I said. "Are you calling to inquire about the distribution?" I set down my coffee. "What distribution?" There was a pause that told me everything before she said a single additional word. My grandfather had died with more than I knew. He had been a quiet man, a retired machinist who drove the same truck for 22 years and grew tomatoes in his backyard, and none of us had any idea he had spent 40 years quietly putting money into low-cost index funds because he had grown up without anything and was determined that his grandchildren wouldn't have to. He had left behind an estate worth $340,000. He had left all of it to me, not to my mother, not split among the family, to me specifically, with a letter explaining that he had watched me my whole life, and he knew what kind of person I was, and he wanted to make sure I had something that was mine, something no one could take from me, something that would let me build a life on my own terms. The estate had been filed 8 years ago. The firm had sent letters to my last known address. They had received a response signed with my name, declining the inheritance and redirecting it to my mother as next of kin. I had never written that letter. I asked the woman to read me the address the letters had been sent to. It was my parents' house in Columbus, the address I had moved away from at 22. The address I had never updated with anyone, because my mother had asked me not to, years ago, saying it was easier for paperwork to come to them, since I moved around so much. I had never moved around. I had lived in the same apartment in Chicago for 6 years. I asked the woman to email me everything she had, every letter, every document, every signature. She said she would have to speak with her supervising attorney first, given the circumstances, but that she would call me back within 24 hours. She called back in 3. The signature on the letter, declining my inheritance, was not my signature. It was close, someone had practiced, but I had been signing my name the same way since the 8th grade, and there are details in it that are mine alone. The document team at the firm had flagged it at the time, apparently, but my mother had followed up in person, with my father, presenting ID, and explaining that I had authorized her to sign on my behalf because I was traveling for work. There was a note in the file. She had come in 2 weeks after my grandfather's funeral. 2 weeks after he died, while I was sending $3,000 to help with the cost of burying him, my mother had walked into an attorney's office and redirected $340,000 that was meant for me. I sat with that for a long time. I sat with it the way you sit with something that breaks a bone, not the sharp first moment, but the hour after, when you understand that the break is real and the healing is going to take much longer than you want it to. I called Renata. She came over that evening with wine she said was for emergencies, and a calm that I was genuinely grateful for. I showed her the documents on my laptop. I watched her read. I watched her expression move through something that wasn't quite shock. She had known me for 2 years. She knew my family. She had sat with me in the hospital while my parents were at a Nashville pool and land somewhere that looked more like confirmation. "Okay," she said, when she finished reading. "What do you want to do?" "I don't know yet," I said. "Do you want to confront them?" I thought about it. I thought about my mother's voice explaining that the flights were non-refundable. I thought about 8 years of $500 here, $3,000 there, $11,000 for kitchen cabinets, and underneath all of it, $340,000 that had been mine and that I had never known existed. I thought about my grandfather growing tomatoes in his backyard and driving the same truck for 22 years because he wanted to give me something no one could take. Someone had taken it. I want to talk to an attorney first, I said. Renata knew an attorney. Of course she did. She was the kind of woman who knew exactly the right person for every situation, which is a skill you develop when you've been handling your own crises for long enough. His name was David. He did estate and financial litigation, and he had a meeting slot open for the following Tuesday. I did not tell my mother any of this. I continued answering her calls. I continued listening to updates about Tyler's engagement, about the ring Kayla had selected, about the venue they were considering. My mother mentioned, twice, that she hoped I was thinking about contributing to the wedding fund, given that Tyler had really come into his own and this was such an important milestone. I said I was recovering and would be in touch. I met with David on Tuesday. He reviewed everything I had brought, the bank records, the estate documents, the signature comparison, the timeline. He was quiet while he read. He asked 3 precise questions. Then he set the papers down and told me what I already suspected. What my mother had done was fraud. The signature was forged. The redirection of the estate was unauthorized. The statute of limitations on estate fraud in Ohio was 8 years, which meant I was within the window barely, but within it. You have options, he said. I asked him to explain them. He explained them. I listened. I asked questions. I went home and I did not sleep, and I went back the next day, and I made a decision. I am not going to describe the legal process in detail, because honestly, it was not dramatic in the way that legal things are on television. There were letters, there were responses. There was a moment when my mother called me crying, the real kind of crying, not the performance she used when she needed something, and told me I was destroying the family, and I listened to her cry for 4 minutes and then I said, "You took the only thing he ever gave me that was only mine," and I hung up. My father called an hour later. He had known. I think I had suspected it, but when he said, "Your mother thought it was for the best," without any apparent understanding of what that sentence meant, I understood that he had always known and had always chosen her version of things. I told him I hoped he understood why I wouldn't be calling them for a while. He didn't respond. I ended the call. Tyler did not call. Tyler texted me a message that said I was being selfish and ruining his engagement, and that I had always been like this, always making everything about myself. I read it twice. I screenshotted it for the file my attorney had asked me to keep. Then I blocked his number. It took 7 months to resolve. At the end of it, my mother repaid the estate from the money that had been in their accounts, money that, I understood now, had largely come from me over the years, which meant I was essentially recovering a fraction of what had flowed out of me in the first place. But the principal was not the amount. The principal was the letter in my grandfather's file, typed on his attorney's stationery, explaining in his careful and uncomplicated language why he had left everything to me. I have watched this girl work her whole life and ask for nothing. I want her to have something that cannot be argued over or asked away. I want her to know that someone saw her. I had that letter framed. It hangs in my apartment now, in the spot where I used to keep a family photo that I packed away last fall. My blood pressure is under control. I see a therapist now, a woman named Carol who does not let me explain away things that are not okay. I started saying no in October. First to small things, then to larger ones, practicing the way you practice anything you should have learned earlier. It still feels unnatural sometimes. I still feel the old pull, the familiar anxiety that something terrible will happen if I disappoint the people who were supposed to love me. Carol says that's normal. She says it takes time to stop flinching from something that was never actually safe to begin with. Renata and I have dinner most Fridays. She is the person who called the ambulance, which means in a very real way she is the reason any of the rest of this happened. I told her that once, and she waved it off and said she would have done it for anyone. I told her that was exactly the point, and she laughed and poured more wine. I have not spoken to my mother, my father, or Tyler in 8 months. My mother sends texts on holidays, brief, careful, nothing like her usual voice. I read them. I don't respond. I used to feel guilty about that, and then I would remind myself of a specific morning. Me in a hospital bed, blood pressure in crisis, watching the phone ring with her name on it, and knowing, even before I answered, that she was calling about a storage unit. I stopped feeling guilty sometime around February. There are things I still carry. I don't think they go away entirely, the years of learning to make myself small, the reflexive calculation of whether my needs are worth the conflict, the strange loneliness of understanding that the family you grew up in was built around a version of you that existed to serve rather than to be loved. I carry those things, but I carry them differently now. Not like a debt, more like a record, proof that something happened, and that I survived it, and that my grandfather, who drove a 20-year-old truck and grew tomatoes and said very little his whole life, had seen something in me worth protecting. He was right that someone would try to take it. He was also right that I would still be here. I still have his letter. Some mornings, I read it before I start work, not because I need the reminder, but because it's good to begin the day knowing that someone, once, looked at you clearly and chose to say so. That turns out to be rarer than you'd think, and worth more than $340,000.